but now it seems most of us are SIRR project partners already. Do you want to say something?
No, I think we can move forward and use the. Yeah.
Perfect. And now most of you already know me. So my name is Wilma, and I come from University West. I'm a social scientist in my background, and I do teaching, research, and project work, basically. And I'm part of SIRR together with Per Asmo, who is also here, and Fredrik Sunnemark. And I was asked to give a speech today about podcasting as a tool or a catalyst for societal development. And before I go to my thoughts about how to use podcast in order to inspire and engage people in societal development, I just want to take a few steps back. Most of us probably know what a podcast is, but I've been doing podcasts now at University West for almost a year. It was content can be shown. Is it the same for all of you? So the rest can see. Maybe if we log out and in. So I've been doing podcasts at University West maybe for a year now. 2023, I was approached in order to do a podcast about crime and crime prevention. And before that, we started up practicing. So we also did something that I listed here as Fritidspodden, where we do podcasts with academic staff about what they're doing on the free time. But the second one, Till Punkt, is the one that we created and released this year. It's about crime and crime prevention, where we are having this work integrated learning perspective as University West have. So we combine talks in a podcast with academics and people from outside the academic life. Can be professionals, citizens, NGOs, and certain representatives within the field. We released it this or 2024 and have made our first season. And the thought with Till Punkt is to give another season with a different theme. So each year, try to release a podcast on a social complex problem. But a podcast, it comes from the terms of combining iPod. I don't know if you remember when we had this iPod, you can listen to certain songs, you can download it to listen, and broadcasting. But it's basically that you have a tool for audio files that comes from the internet that you combine with broadcasting. And in that sense, you got podcast. And it refers to audio content that is often distributed through different subscriptions on internet. We have, for example, Spotify. iPhone has their own podcasting tools. So you can usually subscribe. You get audio files or recordings on a certain time, probably each week, each month, and so on. And it's basically a method of publishing audio files. And what's unique is that they are available to listen to at any time. So it's very suitable for the listener. You can also download them, so you can listen either streamed online or downloaded for offline listening. And that's the basic about podcasts in that sense. So I thought before I also talk for what can a podcast do and how can it contribute to societal development, I thought a little bit of what to think of when creating a podcast, because when I was asked the question to lead a podcast at University West, I had no experience from podcasting itself. So I was trained by a Canadian podcast female who had a lot of successful podcasting in Canada. And we had a 2-day workshop where we tried to map a little bit about our audience and what we are trying to do. What do we want to do? And I think the first and foremost, the most important question when you create a podcast, especially if we're talking about societal development, is who are our listeners? Who is the person that is going to listen to this podcast? because usually what you want everyone to listen to it, but it's a public that is too broad, especially if you want to market your podcast later on. So really focus on this. Who is your ideal listener? Who are we turning to? You also need to think about how long each episode should be. There are different versions today. Some have very short 15 to 20 minutes talks. Some have around an hour, and some are having very long formats. And I think it's beautiful in the world we're living now because we have access to so many media contents. If we're talking about social media, Instagram, TikTok, we're talking about very short formats. We want 30 seconds, maximum a minute to see a video, get the information we want. But podcasting, on the other hand side, is another forum where people tend to listen to longer types of stories that will have time for discussions. So in our society today, we also see these differences between media outlets. So that's just a good thing to think of. Okay, how long is the episode going to be? And with having that in mind also, are you doing a one take? Are you just recording the conversation from start to finish? Or are you going to edit it? Are you going to cut it? Or make shorter parts of the conversation? So important to have in mind. For us, we decided that we wanted, because our theme is that everyone should come there and be able to tell their story, which meant like 20 minutes didn't feel enough because it felt very short and the people would not actually have time to say and tell their story. So we aimed for approximately an hour. Some episodes are a little bit shorter and some are a little bit longer, but we aimed for approximately an hour. And then also thinking about, okay, when are we going to release and how often are we going to release episodes? Really good to have in mind when you start planning for a podcast. Podcast, really, one of the good things is to have consistency. So either that you release every Monday or you release every second week, maybe you release every second day, one time each month. It really doesn't matter. It's just that consistency gives your listeners expectations to know when is the next episode going to be released. And also if you're going to have a podcast on your own, or if you're going to have a podcast when you invite guests, and then also to think about how many guests, because too many guests can work, but it also can be a little bit messy with giving each and everyone an opportunity to speak. We landed in that we wanted 2 to 3 guests, but mostly 2, so that we could have a dialogue between 2 or 3 people, but still limiting it down, because also that would be one of the ways that a conversation could expand for much longer. And also, when you think of creating a podcast, just know that it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time of first going through these questions and setting up a standard. And if you want to have guests, it's a lot of time finding the right guests, who is coming, inviting them, having a conversation with them first. And then when you record, that's probably the easiest part, because then you're in the studio, you record it. And then afterwards, you also have a lot of work with, if you're going to cut episodes, you have a lot of editing to do, but you also want to market it and upload it and all of those kinds of things. So it takes a lot of time. So it is really a commitment to do. And also what we learned was that you want the name of your podcast so people can find it, and you want it to be unique. And the name that you think of first and foremost, probably 100 other people have already thought of. We thought of like the societal pod, but there was already one existing. So we also had to take so many like thoughts around the name, because the unique names, so it's easy to find. A lot of names already exist because podcast has grown so tremendously over the last couple of years. And also that you keep a graphic design that makes your podcast so people can recognize it. At least that you have a profile picture for your podcast, but you can also think of creating unique pictures for each and every episode. So that's also like choices. You have a lot of choices to do before you actually start releasing your podcast. But these were the things that we spent a lot of time on, but also what we were taught was needed in order to create a podcast that actually gets listeners and that can be seen and found. And now I talked a lot about who's your listener, how long will the episodes be, are you inviting guests, and so on. So I thought just a way of thinking on how you could figure this out. I made a little Menti for you. So let's see. If you can scan the QR code, you should probably come to the Menti. I will see if I also can. See if I can swap for you for the results. So what we see here is just a way, now we're all in SIRR and we know each other a little bit, but thinking of, okay, we have a split between public and private sector. So especially when we think about societal development pods, who are our listeners? We decided to go for more of the public sector, municipalities and state authorities. And then now we see that we have a private and public sector. And if we move forward, we have the questions. Why can I not change? Yeah, and the age. Now you should be able to vote for that as well. Yeah, and as we see them, we say, okay, now we have an age gap closer to between 36 and 65. Moving on, we come to during what activities are you listening to podcast? This question can help us a little bit to identify. And with activities, I'm thinking of commuting, training, cooking, before bed, like when or during what activities are you listening to a podcast? And it's a free answer kind of thing. But this can also help us, because I think you can vote already here. Walking, traveling, cooking. This can help us to give an initial thought of when people are listening or in what kind of room. And also, moving on to the next question, while the answers are just dropping in, is at what times are these activities happening, or at what time are you listening to podcasts? Is it during the morning, the afternoon, the evening? When do you prefer? Yes, also here we see a lot of people listening here during the evening, which means that when you're thinking about your release schedule, you might not need to release it at 8 in the morning. It could be fine to release it during lunch, or maybe even later. So this also helps you with your consistency and when you're publishing, but people usually expect some continuation and consistency. And also the question, how long are the podcast episodes that you prefer to listen to? Usually, what are you listening to? What's the duration of time? Yeah, kind of equal. And the 20 to 40 minutes is now rising. which would indicate if this is your group of people that you're trying to sell your podcast to within societal development, then maybe, okay, my group that I'm trying to sell this podcast to, they prefer 20, 40 or 40 to 60 minutes approximately, which can also guide you in how long your episode should be. And also, I think this is the last one. If you are my group for podcasts, what topics are you interested in? What topics do you like to listen to? Within social development or in general, feel free to think of what are you usually listening to? What is interesting for you? And now, obviously, this Mentimeter is like a small scale kind of investigation, but it tells something about how you can think when you're thinking about themes, when you're thinking about, okay, what topics are we going to discuss? My people, or the ones I'm planning to release this podcast to, my potential listeners, they prefer to listen in this type of environment. They prefer to focus on these types of topics. They are highly interesting. They like to listen during the evening, which means that my release schedule could always come at lunch. It means that my people who listen when they commute, they can listen when they go back home. The people who cook in the evening also have the podcast ready. So it gives you a little bit of ideas of how you can work when you plan your podcast. Obviously, this is done in a small scale with the community who is listening now, but it can be helpful when you're planning for future podcasts. And this was just a way of how to think. And I will go back to my presentation about your podcasting. And also a way of just getting inspired of how you can find your group of people and how to release, because it is tricky and there's really no right answers, but you can just do as best as you can. And for me, as leading a podcast, also brand new for me, it's basically that you have the main role. You are the one who's going to guide the conversations. You are the one who's going to connect both with the audience, but also make your guests connect. And what you usually like to do in a podcast is not creating this radio interview where you ask questions back and forth. Conversational is what we're looking for. So how are you asking questions that don't become an interview that goes back and forth, but becomes a discussion? Because that was something I struggled with in the beginning. To be there with two different actors, they might not know each other, and you want to create a conversation where you talk about a topic as if you were just having a coffee. That was our main kind of goal with our podcasts. And also things to think about when you're leading a podcast is to really listen and maybe take down notes, because people tend to talk and there's so much things that people, when they sit at home, think, oh, that was interesting. Why couldn't they talk more about that? And it's so easy when you are there, you're ready to ask your questions. But when we're looking for a conversation, we really want to dig deep, especially when we talk about these complex societal issues. And that's why I wrote a point that said, if it's edited, if you're going to cut and edit your episodes and not have a one take, don't be afraid to ask again for clarity. Because especially if you invite professional and academics to your pod, we tend to speak in a specific language. We use the terms that we are used to in our work and our daily lives. They might not be understood the same for individuals working privately or not within the field. So if you edit and if you cut, don't be afraid to ask, sorry, can you please repeat that answer, but make it a little bit more simple for people who's not in the field to understand. So you really work with the guest and also challenge them to explain it on simple ways. And if you hear certain facts or you hear certain words that you don't know, ask. Just ask to get it, because if you are wondering, people at home are wondering too. And you, as a main role or a leader of a podcast, you've probably done a little bit of research beforehand, so you already know more than most of your listeners. So really dare to ask questions. And as I also stated, clear and concise language that goes hand in hand, to be clear and use a simple language for your listeners. And also to contextualize ideas and encourage examples, because now we have professional academics or whoever we invite to our podcast. Try to use them to put it into real world contexts, compare different contexts so that it becomes relatable for your listener. And because you already have made your little listener analysis of who you're going to give this podcast to or send your episodes to, you kind of know what type of listener you have as well. And your role, as I said, with guiding the conversations and connecting with the audience also means that you are the one who's giving a story, and you are the one who lead the audience between different questions. And that should feel quite seamlessly if you're doing it in a conversational way. And as I've said before, take notes or have someone else being a second pair of eyes to just clarify things that can be a little bit unclear. And I think for me, this is why we created Fritidspodden, the one where we talk with academics about what they do in the spare time, because I had to practice being in the studio. I had to practice leading conversation that was not an interview kind of setting, that was not too academic. So this is also coming down to practice. As with everything that we want to be good at, we just need to practice and practice and practice. But these are just some of the key things that you need to think of if you are planning to lead a podcast. And also to think of a podcast. I named it, is it a podcast or is it a project? Because a podcast comes with different stages. The first one is a pre-production. Let's see if it works for me. It doesn't. Yes. And the pre-production is what I've talked about already. The brainstorming, deciding how many episodes, what is the theme of the season, how are you going to have the layout of the episodes? Are you going to cut? Are you going to have a one take? You're going to make a production schedule. You are finding guests. You're doing pre-interviews. So you see that this guest is the right guest to have on your show. How are they speaking? How are they talking? What kind of questions do you need? Is this a person that likes to throw around complicated concepts, or you just want to get a sense of the person you're inviting? So pre-interviews is a brilliant idea. You need to think about theme music. You need to think of what access do you have to music and the legal rights for music. You need to think about your graphic design. You need to think about communication. How are you marketing your podcast? All of this is happening before the podcast is taking place. So the first stage is almost like planning a project. You do a plan for your podcast and you do all of this before work. And then you're moving forward to the production. And what we really wanted to do here was during the production day, it's one of the most easy days because you're going to record. But it has to do with this getting comfortable. So what we did, we met before, we had a coffee with the guest. We made the guest meet each other, talk a little bit. Who are they? Who am I? What are we going to talk about today? You obviously also have the choice if you want to send questions beforehand or if you want to give the questions during the podcast recording. Depends a little bit on what you want with your guests and what you want with the theme. But we met before, we got comfortable, and then we also got into the studio. We tested the equipment because it is a little bit different where you're going to have your microphone, how close, how far away, to have your headphones on, hearing yourself speaking. So we spent approximately 50 minutes in the studio with the guests, talking and just getting comfortable. And something that's really important to think of while recording a podcast is to avoid time-sensitive phrases. Like yesterday, they released a new law, because someone might listen to this podcast in a year. And then yesterday is a very confusing word. So you would always try to, if someone, because it happens naturally that you say, hey, just last week I was out doing this, to just put it into context. Okay, where are we at what time, to make it easier for the listeners. Post-production, you have to listen through the audio through your headphones. You hear the same way that your listeners, because most of us will listen to the podcast in headphones. You write show notes or notes for your releasing. If you've been to Spotify looking for podcast, there's usually always a little description of your episodes. You make probably a little bit of quick clips that you can use for your marketing, short audio files of videos, where you take the most interesting part from your podcast to make it engaging for your audience. Usually we try to find emotionally powerful moments so that everyone felt like, oh, this is interesting. I really want to hear what is he talking about. But it also has a lot to do with editing. Distribution comes down to your communication strategy, teasers, marketing. Are you using social media? Are you using email, newsletters? How are you marketing your podcasts? And then putting it out to the world, uploading it to one of the podcasts distributions. We used Spotify because that for us was the easiest. And the last slide just about the creation of a podcast before we're moving on to the impact kind of podcasts. I made a slide that said the more technical stuff. And my beautiful AI picture of a female wrapped in cords is just because I have nothing to do with the technical stuff. I was happy to work together with media technicians at University West to help me both edit, cut, upload, and all of these things. And that was one of my being part of a podcast at University West. I said, I can talk and I can find the guests and I can write the script. But when it comes down to editing and audio quality and all of that, I know nothing. And if I'm going to be part of a podcast, I want that to be quality. So I was happy to work together with one of our media technicians who previously been releasing podcasts on his own. And at University West, we record with something called Rodecaster. It's a hardware-based tool, but basically use what you know. Because you can record with almost anything. You can record with a computer, you can record with a phone, you can record on Zoom. As long as it allows you to record, you can use it. The most important is that the audience or your listeners can hear what you are going to say. So use what you know, because it will also make it easier for you. But also the good sound quality is important, because when you listen, you want your listeners to have a pleasant experience. So if you are going to buy one thing or focus on one thing, try to focus on a good microphone to capture the sound. Very good. There are 2 online tools. There are more tools that you can use. We have some people here that've been creating podcasts, so they might even have more tools for editing. These are online tools that you can use for editing your podcast. If you're going to edit, sometimes we just release this one takes. You just log into Zoom, record it, download the audio files, and you can upload it. So it can be as simple as you want. But with this being said about the technical stuff, not my strongest area. I gave this to someone that was more professional. And I did it basically because I thought quality matters when it comes to podcasting. And this was just my brief of how to think before and while creating a podcast and your role as a podcast leader. And the next part, I want to focus more on how we can use podcast for societal development. But before moving there, do you have any questions about podcasts or creation or something like that? No. Maybe? Yes?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Can you put a link to one of your podcasts we can hear?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
I can give it to you and mine. You can send it out together to the whole group, maybe. Marcelo, yes.
I was just thinking in terms of following and like contacting the followers and stuff like that. How do you keep track of it? Like, I know that some people have like an email list that they create, or maybe they can see the amount of followers on Spotify or something like that. And, you know, some people press the follow button so you get like an update when there's a new one, just to, you know, send out important information to your followers and keep all that going? How do you work with that?
So usually we followed the listeners and the followers and everything on Spotify, because Spotify gives you a lot of data, how many listen to the episodes, how many unique listeners did you have, how many follows. We also put up so people could comment on the episodes, but it didn't really give us who is listening. So what we used to reach out, we used a lot of University West's channels on social media, both on Instagram and on LinkedIn and on Facebook. We also paid for marketing for our marketing strategies for the first 2 episodes, so that we could have a push in the beginning. And then we continued to make this short, quick clips to upload on social media. And then we had a paid for the end of the episodes when it's finalized. And we also decided to finish our podcast with inviting politicians to University West and do a live podcasting, also to just keep, because so our pod was about crime prevention or crimes in general, what is happening, how are we working, what is happening, and we had different themes and whose responsibility it is. And then we asked everyone to give us something to bring to the politicians. So we decided to not have politicians in the podcast, but end with a final episodes with politicians. So we worked a lot on the public channels, basically, and invited students, since we have students at University West, to events of release and try to marketize the podcast. That's how we worked. And also at our newsletter at university to get it out to staff members. Yes.
Yep. Thank you.
No problem. Julie.
Usually you edit all your episodes, or you just go with the non-edited episodes, because it seems to me like if you want to have, it must be difficult to edit the podcast if you want still to have that conversation kind of spirit to it.
Yeah. So for our easier podcast where we talk about academics on their free time, we just do a one take because it's quite an easy conversation. For our other podcast about societal issues or development, we actually edit it, but it comes with some difficulties, especially if to find the right moment to cut, because we tend to speak all the time with little breaks, and you want it to seem naturally. So this was all done by my media technician. But what we did is when we recorded, because we really had this opportunity, or I really worked with this, asking questions to clarify, to dig a little bit deeper, which meant that we had a lot of repetitions and the episodes became very long. So we decided that we need to cut them in order for people to listen through the whole episode. So what we did is when we had the audio file, we uploaded it to a Word document so it can transcribe it. And then we marked it. If we saw that there was a lot of repetition, we could mark it as potentially this does not need to be there. And especially my role, since I was just leading the podcast, when I talked a little bit too much, we just cut myself out to make it shorter. But it is, as you say, it's a challenge to find where you can cut and still keep the conversation going without making. But there's tricks for it. But it depends also on what type of topic and that you have, I would say.
Thank you.
Yes. Gitte, do you have another question?
Yes.
Yes.
Wilma, if you should do a podcast, not behave on the university, but as a private, how do you earn money on doing podcasts?
Good question, because since we're at the university, we didn't think of earning money at all. But I know that some of my friends who does it, they use, when they have a larger listening round, they have a lot of ads, or not a lot of ads, but you might have an ad in between. You can also have, I know some of the more famous podcasts in Sweden, they have supporter groups, so they release the episodes a little bit beforehand to some people, and they do a subscription where they pay for it. I don't know, maybe someone of you who do your podcast on your own have an experience of earning money. Adam?
Yes and no. I've been podcasting for 12 years and in very niche areas. And I think that if we are not famous, earning money from podcasting is really, really hard.
Yeah.
We must see that. So what I think we should think of as private persons is more that podcasting becomes also a marketing tool. I'm doing a podcast about photography. The podcast is free and it's also on YouTube, so it's also a video. But on the side, I do photography training classes, and that's where I earn my money. So the podcast and YouTube videos are to educate and to get it out into the public, but it's not. It's really, really hard if we are speaking Danish or Swedish or smaller languages to get an audience big enough to make it into a living. Some people do, but it takes a lot of work. So I think that seeing it as a revenue gathering tool, that could be hard. But one thing you could do, and one of my podcasts is hosted on Substack, is that you can do. We have a free Substack, and then there's also the opportunity to make a pay for Substack where you can have bonus episodes and things like that. That might work if your audience is big enough.
Yeah. Marcelo?
Yeah, that's why I just was asking how you like keep track of your followers and stuff like that, because as far as I know, a lot of people, they create like a email list. They will maybe have like you can get these free PDF or something like that if you sign up here, and then you start gathering like a list of people that you can reach out that are interested in your podcast, and let's say it's about health, and then you offer to those people the chance to get a free tutoring or something within the subject or something like that, and then like you maybe not, as the others were talking about, earn money on the podcast commercial themselves, but more on the kind of side business that's made on top of the podcast. I'm not a podcaster myself. I just listen to a lot of podcasters that talk about how they do it. And yeah, that's another way to do it as well.
Yeah. And I think just the difference for us releasing it as a public authority, we never had the ambition of getting money. It's just to get it out and get listeners. So that differs a little bit because we didn't have any thought of revenue or getting money at all, because this is just knowledge production, basically. Adam, did you have another question? Or...
No, I just forgot to.
Perfect. I think I'm moving on then.
Unraise my hand.
To let's see, to the topic that we named this podcast. We named it, or this talk, we named it podcast as a catalyst for societal development. And it's a little bit of how we can use it, or experiences that I got from our first podcast, since it was also my first one that we tried to get out broader. And also, being famous and releasing a podcast is great. Being a public authority sometimes is not as sexy and selling. So we really had to work on how we get it out and how do we get people to listen. So also what I have learned and what I have experienced and how we can use it for societal development if we want to make an impact, I get it down into, I think, 5 different points. The first one is that a podcast offers an opportunity for as a meeting point for diverse perspectives. It's a way of inviting people with diverse perspectives. The second one is that podcasts can be used as a 2-step learning experience. I will come back to that soon. Podcasts, we can use them for tackling complex issues with a long-term vision. And especially long-term vision is something that I learned through this podcast that I'm holding on to very hard. So I will come back to that as well. I also see podcast as a platform for engagement and mobilization, both among professionals, but also our citizens. And the fifth one is that a podcast is accessible and inclusive. So it's for everyone. So I think these are the 5 points I want to talk about when we talk about podcast for societal development. And the first one is that it is a meeting point for diverse perspectives. And SIRR project talks a lot about sustainability. And I think if we're talking about complex societal issues such as sustainable development and sustainability, I think we all can agree upon that it requires a collective effort from different sectors of society. We are talking about entrepreneurs, scientists, activists, citizens, NGOs, both the public and the private sector. We all need to come together. And I think podcasts offers an opportunity for our different kind of stakeholders to come together and share their expertise. Obviously, it comes down to you as a podcast leader to invite different people and to invite people from all of these different areas. But I think especially when we talk about sustainability, that it spans beyond one single group. We need to come together, we need to share our perspectives, and we need to share our expertise. And I think that if you invite the right people and you get this mix of people, we have a podcast that can bridge gaps between different individuals from different fields so that they can come together and have this cross-field collaboration, talk about experiences and solutions together of what they're experiencing, what they're tackling, what are they seeing, what are their challenges, and how can that be met and seen from different perspectives. So it comes down to, with the right people, we can get collaboration, we can get collective efforts. And podcast in that sense, for you as a podcast leader, you can really create a neutral space. So it's not within a political field, it's not like in any like setting that is pressuring, it's a neutral space. Some people might feel a little bit nervous being recorded and published. So what we did when we invited everyone to come, because we wanted everyone's perspective, we said we will allow you to listen to the podcast first and then approve to us, yes, I approve this for being published. It gives everyone a little bit more relief to feel like, okay, this can be released to the public. And also with this theme of a meeting point for diverse perspectives, it's not only that they come together and they talk about a certain issue or a certain theme, it's also creating connections. And that was something we saw when I was the one inviting. People met in the studio that's never been meeting before, but they worked with the same type of questions. So at one part, we had a head of a school. We had someone working for Save the Children. And we also had one from a researcher. They haven't met before, but they met in the studio. They discussed. They came up with really brilliant ideas. They had some, I agree with you, or I disagree with you. But having this conversation, they also decided to swap their contacts to keep on working together. So meeting point for diverse perspectives, one way of discussing, but also a way of connecting people. And I think that also is very good to be a facilitator for connections. Secondly, is a two-step learning experience. Maybe it's just because I come from the university and with a teaching background, but I really see podcasts as a two-step learning experience, where the first learning experience happens while you have this live dialogue during the recording. And this comes down to what I just talked about. We have guests that comes from different fields. They come and engage. They have this thought exchange. They have different perspectives. They have different backgrounds. They come there, they share their expertise, and they challenge each other in their viewpoints. So we have one learning happening here just by collecting people from different fields, from public, from private, from different professions, citizens, NGOs. And when this is happening and these conversations happens, and you ask them to together define a problem or come up with perspectives on problems, we have a starting point for this co-creation of knowledge. So how are we together viewing and defining such a complex, wicked problem as most of our societal development issues are? So it's one to have this back and forth dialogue. We are creating a setting in the studio where we are learning together and where we are challenging each other. So very good conversations where we are co-creating and we challenge each other and we work with our thoughts and our perspectives. So that's just the first kind of learning experience I see. The second learning experience I see with a podcast, it is the listening experience. So when you listen to your podcast, it means that if you have somewhat of a societal development or learning podcast, you are offering an audio file that is published online, available to listen at what time you want, and you can pause it, you can go back, you can re-listen, which means that we offer an opportunity for people to listen and learn at their own pace and at their own time. It means it's very accessible, and it allows for a deeper kind of reflection. So when people have the time and they can go back and they can listen, and when they listen, they also apply it to their perspective and their viewpoint, we also have a second learning experience. So it might be new perspectives also to the listener when we invite different people. Maybe they are having a similar perspective to one of the guests you have in the studios and will be challenged by the other twos, or they are just gathering this, listening, reflecting, and learning a little bit on their own. And also to remember that individuals that listens, if they're citizens, when they listen, they also have the opportunity to apply the knowledge and the discussions that are discussed in podcast to their everyday life and situation, either to agree and disagree. And hence, we usually like to add a little comment box to our podcast episodes for people to write. And it also gives this opportunity for individuals to engage and say, okay, but I'm also working in this sector and I came across this and this and this. It emphasizes also a learning experience. So I see it in two ways, two learning experiences where you can use a podcast. So the first one, we facilitate for diverse perspectives to meet. Secondly, we offer learning experiences, both for the ones we invite to our studio, but also for our listeners, which is very important when we're talking about societal development. Thirdly, I mentioned this long-term vision to tackle complex issues. And I think when you bring people together in the studio and they come with all of these different perspectives, you can ask them to define a problem. They have different perspectives, they will have different views, but if you try to ask them to define the problem, so what is the problem? If we talk about innovation, what issue do we have in our local community? Can we define it together? What are we seeing? What is the most stressful or the most emerging problems that we have? There will be different perspectives, but if you work with them and try to build a consensus around the problem, we create a vision of, okay, this is our mutual vision. These are the most stressing issues that we have now. When you have a consensus around the problem and when you have defined the problem, you can offer an opportunity to think, okay, but how do we want it instead? And I think this is something that is very important, especially when we come to societal issues that are working now. We have a lot of issues that are happening right now, which means that we are attacking the problem as it is because we have to fix what is now. But we also need to think of, okay, but what do we want in the future? And in the podcast, you can help building a consensus around the problem, but you can also try to build a consensus of what do we need and how do we want our society to look in 5 or 10 years. And when we have this discussion of how we want it to be, then we can also start to think of, okay, but if we want this in 5 years, what steps do we need to take to get there? What can we bring to the table? What are differences to reach this vision that we have in 5 years? It leads to a conversation that is more future forward and usually much more positive, because it gets to this, okay, this is what we want. How can we, with our differences, work to get there? And this is what I mean when you come together, you can create this long-term vision to tackle complex issues. It still needs to address immediate needs, but it's also planning for the future. And it's engaging, and it means that if you think 5 years forward with us being together, we have already included everyone in the steps to moving forward. So I think this is very important to have in mind when you think about podcast for societal development. What do we want? And what can each and every one of us in the studio today do to reach this endpoint? And it's also inspiring for change. So by hearing people, how they come together, try to use a podcast to also give out those plant the little carrots for people at home to also bring, like, okay, what can I do? If this is the vision and I agree with that, what can I do? So create this inspiration for change. And also when you have people in the studio from real world, from different professions, from different backgrounds, talk about real world examples. What have we done so far to move forward? Because when we talk about societal issues and societal development, and we're focusing on now, sometimes it can feel devastating and terrible. So use example of successes too. Okay, but we have already done this and it's in the right direction. So continuing doing this, we can see this and this moving to our common vision. But really think, and I think this is for all when we think about societal development, long-term vision based on diverse perspectives. And then the next step and it relates a lot to this, is that a podcast can be used as a form for engagement and mobilization, both because you have a platform with listeners where you have societal issues that actually need engagement. We want people on board. We want people to engage. We want all of these different perspectives. So episodes can really spotlight community-driven projects. It can talk about grassroots organizations and how they are engaged, and really try to build, because sometimes there is also a lack of knowing how to engage. So when you talk about this common vision and where we're going, also talk about how can each and every one be a part? How can you engage? And how, if you want to engage in this topic, where do you start? So you can also highlight the areas where you need input and where you need help and where we need collaboration. Talk about different, we already have a lot of things happening in municipalities, in the countries, where people meet and discuss. They discuss with politicians, they're usually invited, but highlight these. What are the forums that exist? Where can I as a citizen go to participate, to be a part of development? And then also empower audience to take action. Give them examples of actionable takeaways. How can they contribute? How can they come with initiatives? Where can they send their ideas? So you can really, when you talk about vision and when you talk about things that are happening, you can also invite and inspire. So I think that is important to have in mind, that everything you say can be a catalyst for people to engage. And also, as I said, podcasts is accessible and inclusive. Basically, what you need is an internet connection. Otherwise, a podcast, it's not bound geographically. You can listen wherever you are. You can listen from whatever country you come from. So it is also a way of providing knowledge and information to a broader range of people. You don't have to come physically. You can be wherever you want to listen. So it reaches beyond traditional formats where we might have conferences or we have politicians hosting a meeting in the town hall. by using a podcast, we can reach further. Obviously, this is also a challenge of how we are reaching people. But if we work the right way, if we market it the right way, we make it accessible and we make it inclusive. It's for everyone, no matter where you are, who you are. And this can also help us overcome barriers that might otherwise prevent individuals from participating in discussions that concern sustainability, crime prevention, aging, or whatever societal issue that we have. So keeping it in a conversational tone and with easy, accessible language, as I also talked about previously, is also a way of including everyone. Speak on terms for everyone to understand and make the content digestible. So it's easy, make it related to these real world cases. And something that we're also talking about in the future talks about storytelling. Build a story in your podcast so people can follow, they can listen, they can make connections, and they can relate the topics to their own life. I think that is very important, but I think this is one of the most important things why podcasts can be used for societal development. It's because it is accessible and it is inclusive. And that was my 5 good things, and obviously that comes with challenges. One of the things, technical learning curve. The things I talked about before, audio quality is very important. Poor sound can really turn listeners away. You want to learn how can you take away background sounds? How do you get the same volume for everyone? You want the listening experience to be nice. Editing a podcast can also be time consuming. And you also have to learn how to cut and how do you fix audio issues if you're on your own. If you have a professional nearby, just grab them, make the best do what they can. And also audience engagement. I think it comes a little bit first with consistency, that you maintain a regularity, and keeping a consistent releasing schedule is very important. But most of us, we have another job that takes a lot of time. So this can also be an issue, but remember, consistency is important. And with consistency, we still want to make our episodes interesting. So we don't want content that becomes boring just because we want to release the podcast. So think of that. And audience engagement, challenges with first building an audience and then retaining an audience. That we're building audience expectations with all our marketing, and that we need to face that. We somehow would like feedback from our audience. How do we get that? And also resources and time to first do the whole project of pre-production, production, post-production, resources in time of money, time and money. And it costs if you do it as an employment, and for your equipment. So there are challenges to be aware of. It's not just smooth sailing, but it also comes with a lot of opportunities. And I just spoke about this. I see the time is running out, but be consistent, make sure that the sound is good, have pre-meetings with your guests so you know what they are talking about, how they're speaking. Try to be relaxed, help your guests to relax you. We get this conversational going. And remember, it takes time from planning to releasing. And I have another mentee, but I think we can skip it for now. And just if there are any questions, feel free to contact me. You have my email at the bottom here. And before mentee or whatever, or if we're even doing the mentee, do we have questions, thoughts? Because I think that is more important with the time being so short. Or agreements or disagreements. You're allowed to come with your diverse perspectives too. No, maybe not. Then feel free. Yeah, Alistair, raise your hand. Hello.
I'm listening. Very useful and very useful presentation full of tips and tricks and tips, what you've learned in this period, which is great. And I was wondering when you said that at the beginning you commented that it's or let's say you showed us to turn around the perspective and think about what the target group might be interested in. But I'm also wondering, I mean, I would do a podcast because I'm passionate about something. But how does that behave? This, let's say you have an interest and want to do something, but you notice that your audience has a slightly diverging interest, or I don't know, how do you manage that? Would I just continue doing what I like, or how do I adapt to those interests and needs without losing what I'm interested in doing? I don't know if you faced this, because it might be a different setting, but
Yeah, for me, it's a little bit of a different setting because I was mostly provided with the topic I was supposed to talk about, and that's how the episodes will come. But I think if we're talking about individually wanting to inspire for change or societal development, or individually starting a podcast, it usually comes down to a personal interest. And I tend to think when you're passionate about something, that's when you can spend hours doing research, finding the right people in the field. And when you notice that someone is passionate about something, that's also how you like the podcast, and the quality will be much better, because from passion also comes a lot of quality. I think it comes down to finding your audience, and that can be very difficult, because your audience is not always the one you think it is.
yeah.
But for example, when we use Spotify, we get a little bit of data of the people who are listening. That can help you in your direction. But maybe if you belong to some kind of organization or something within the topic, try to market it to the people you know and let them reshare. Because that was also something that we did when we had guests. We had some guests that had larger following bases.
Yeah.
We tagged them so that they could repost, because we knew if their followers saw, at least they would listen. And hopefully, if they listened to one and thought that was good, maybe they stayed for a second. So it's just about finding these ways of finding your audience and keeping them engaged. And we also try to plan for a season when to put the best episodes. So that's also a thing. Like, you want the first 2-3 episodes to be great, because that's when we catch our audience.
Well, that's
so
difficult.
we also recorded 6 episodes the whole season before we released it. So we knew what we had.
What was the best? Yeah.
So, and also not having the pressure of stressing to find new guests for episode 3 and 4. So we wanted everything recorded, so we knew we just had the season to release every week without being stressed. So that's also different. But I would at least advise to have the first 2 recorded when you start releasing.
Good idea.
So you know that you can manage to keep the consistency.
Yeah, cool. How much info does Spotify give you, more than, location, age? How much do you really know? What do they provide?
They provide a little bit of information. Now it's my media technician who has most of the access, but also how many listen, how many unique listeners, how many listen to the full episode. Because they also have how many that listened, but they might just have listened the first 10 seconds. So that doesn't say much.
Yeah. The
So
dropout quote. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Sorry, I don't want to let
no problem.
Emma also ask a question.
Yes, Emma, please.
Yeah, first thing is thank you very much, Wilma, for this presentation, and I'm really much looking forward to follow up on this question, because I know that communication is like so important for all hubs, and also for rural areas, so to say, to come together, talking or discussing different topics. But I will also maybe you could just pitch your podcast a little bit before you send a link, because I will remember you also told me that the topic for this spring will be a little bit connected to SIRR. And like I said, I'm also looking forward to follow up with this topic within all the hubs in the project, and see what kind of communication channels you use, and also if you're continuing working on, developing podcast yourself, and see what we can do together within the SIRR project. But and thank you again for a really interesting presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, so the podcast, unfortunately, in Swedish, we have talked about if we should swap it to English for future reference or for future topics. First season we had, as I said, talked about crime and different perspectives of crime and how we can, how can we work with it and what solutions are there and what are we already doing. And we invited different stakeholders with different responsibilities. We are currently working on producing a season 2. Season 2, we have not yet set the topic. We have 2 in mind, and one is especially sustainability. And that's relating a little bit more to the SIRR project. We're just looking for who, at the university we have different faculties and different organizations. So we're just trying to find a place where the podcast can be hosted for the future. But what we're trying to look at is sustainability, and maybe looking at sustainability in terms of economic, social, and I dropped it, economic, social, and environmental. So it might be a shorter season with only 3 episodes. And a third topic we are also keen on exploring is security in general and total defense, and because that's also highly interesting topic at the moment. So that's the 2 probably coming seasons. But we are currently now just working on, okay, what comes first and who are we going to invite? Do we have researchers to come in and talk as well? So yes, but I will definitely provide a link. And for everyone who has questions or want to ask more specifically about something, please email me. And I also, if there's parts of technical stuff, I can help you, connect you to Henrik Oskott, who's been my media technician. That's been helping me a lot. So feel free, just email for questions or thoughts and feedback. It's been fun to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Wilma, and thank you